Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Hollow Pines. The sign at the edge of Hollow Pines Forest was worn, the paint faded by years of rain and neglect. The words were barely legible, but you could still make them out if you squinted. Beware. Enter at your own risk. Naturally, the group of friends thought it was a joke. It's probably some old ghost story to keep kids from partying out here, said Ethan, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. His confidence was infectious, as it always was, and the others followed him past the sign without hesitation. Jess, Ethan's girlfriend, glanced back at the warning as they crossed into the woods. She couldn't help but feel like it was staring at her, like the faded words were etched into her brain. She shook it off, adjusting the straps of her own bag. The four of them, Ethan, Jess, Harper, and Dan, had planned this camping trip for months. Hollow Pines was remote, beautiful, and most importantly, quiet. No cell reception, no tourists, just endless miles of towering trees and trails. They wanted an escape from the noise of the city, and Ethan swore this was the perfect place. By the time they reached their chosen campsite, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The trees loomed high above them, their branches knitting together in a canopy so thick it almost felt like night had already fallen. It's kind of creepy, isn't it? Harper said as she helped unpack the tent. Her voice was light, but her eyes darted nervously around the clearing. It's a forest, Ethan replied with a grin. They're all creepy if you think about it too much. Dan laughed. Yeah, Harper, relax. There's nothing out here but squirrels and maybe a bear if we're lucky. But as they set up camp, Jess couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was subtle, like the air itself was heavy, pressing down on her shoulders. The silence didn't help. There were no birds chirping, no rustling leaves. Just the occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the whisper of wind through the branches. By the time they lit the campfire, the unease had crept into all of them. They sat in a circle, staring into the flames and exchanging half-hearted jokes. Do you think the stories are true? Harper asked suddenly. What stories? Ethan said, poking the fire with a stick. Harper hesitated. You know, the disappearances. People say the forest takes you. Jess shivered. What does that even mean? Harper shrugged. I don't know. My grandmother used to say the trees were alive. Like really alive. She said they could see you, hear you. And if you weren't careful, they'd pull you in. Ethan snorted. Your grandma watched too many movies. But Jess noticed how Harper didn't laugh, and neither did Dan. The night deepened, and the fire burned low. Eventually, they crawled into their tents, the forest quiet once more. But Jess couldn't sleep. She lay on her back, staring up at the fabric of the tent, listening to the unnatural silence. That's when she heard it, a voice, soft and familiar, just outside. Jess. Her blood turned to ice. It was faint, almost like a breath, but unmistakable. Jess. It sounded like her mother, who was hundreds of miles away. Jess sat up, her heart pounding. Ethan, she whispered, but he was fast asleep beside her. The voice came again, closer this time. "Jess, come here." She unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold night air. The forest was shrouded in darkness, the trees standing like silent sentinels. But there, just beyond the fire's dying glow, she saw movement. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The shadows shifted, and for a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing among the trees. But when she stepped closer, it was gone. Behind her, a branch snapped. She spun around, but there was nothing there. "Jess!" Harper's voice made her jump. Jess turned to see Harper standing outside her tent, looking just as pale and frightened. "You heard it too?" Jess whispered. Harper nodded. "It sounded like my dad. He's been gone for years, but it was him. I swear." Before Jess could respond, Ethan and Dan stumbled out of their tents, both looking shaken. "Something's wrong," Ethan said, his bravado gone. "We need to leave. Now." But as they gathered their things, the whispers began again. This time, they came from all around them, overlapping voices calling their names in tones that were both familiar and wrong. The trees seemed to close in, their branches twisting and reaching like claws. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath their feet felt unsteady, as though the forest itself was shifting. Dan pointed to a trail. "This way. Let's go." They ran, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the darkness. But no matter how far they went, the whispers followed. And then Jess saw it. The tree ahead was massive, its trunk gnarled and blackened as if by fire. But what made her stop in her tracks was the face. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, pressed into the bark like something trying to push its way out. Its mouth was open in a silent scream, its eyes wide with terror. Harper screamed, and Jess turned to see more faces appearing in the trees around them. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Ethan grabbed her arm. "Don't look. Keep moving." But the forest wouldn't let them go. Roots erupted from the ground, snaking around their ankles and pulling them down. The whispers grew louder, deafening, as the trees seemed to lean in, their branches reaching for the panicked group. One by one, they were taken. Jess watched in horror as Dan was dragged into the hollow trunk of a tree, his screams muffled as the bark closed around him. Harper was next, her face frozen in terror as the roots pulled her under. Jess and Ethan ran until their lungs burned, but the forest was endless. When Jess tripped, Ethan stopped to help her up, but his expression froze. "What?" Jess asked, her voice shaking. Ethan pointed to a tree behind her. Her own face stared back at her from the bark. The hollow pines forest remains untouched to this day. No one dares venture into its depths. The faces in the trees are a silent warning, a testament to those who dared to enter and never returned. Story 2. The Ghost Campfire. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the mountains, spilling long shadows across the dense pine forest. The Callahan family, James, his wife Sarah, and their 10-year-old daughter Emily, had been hiking for hours, their boots crunching on the carpet of dead leaves and twigs. Tired and eager to find a spot to set up camp, they followed the faint smell of smoke wafting through the cool evening air. When they stumbled upon the clearing, it felt almost too perfect, An old campsite sat nestled among the trees, complete with a ring of large stones circling a small, crackling campfire. The flames danced lazily, casting a warm glow on the surrounding trees. "Someone must have just left," James said, scanning the area. The campsite looked abandoned, but the fire was too fresh. There were no tents, no backpacks, no sign of the campers who might have started it. Emily tugged at Sarah's sleeve. "Is it okay to stay here? It feels weird." Sarah hesitated, her eyes lingering on the fire. "It's strange, sure, but we're exhausted, and we'd have to hike another hour to find another spot. Let's just stay here tonight." Reluctantly, they unpacked their gear, pitching their small tent a few feet from the fire. Emily sat close to the flames, poking at the embers with a stick while James and Sarah prepared a modest dinner. As the sky turned from twilight to a deep, velvety black, an uneasy silence settled over the clearing. There were no sounds of crickets or owls, just the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. After dinner, they sat around the fire, its warmth a welcome reprieve from the biting cold. James told a story about his own childhood camping trips, trying to lighten the mood. Emily giggled, though her eyes kept darting toward the shadows beyond the firelight. "I think someone's watching us," she whispered. James frowned. "There's no one out here, sweetheart. We're miles from the nearest town." But Sarah had noticed it too, a strange sensation, as if unseen eyes were boring into them from the darkness. She dismissed it as exhaustion and tried to push the thought away. Then the fire changed. The flames, once a bright orange, deepened into a strange, flickering blue. The family froze as a vision began to take shape within the fire. The flickers and sparks coalesced into images, shadowy figures moving through the flames like actors on a ghostly stage. "Well, what is that?" Sarah whispered, clutching Emily close. The fire showed a scene of brutality. A group of people dressed in old-fashioned clothing stood in the very clearing where the Callahans now sat. They were arguing, their voices silent, but their gestures frantic. One man stepped forward, brandishing a knife. Then came the screams, though they didn't match the silent figures. The cries of pain and terror filled the clearing, echoing in the Callahans' ears. Blood splattered across the ground in the vision as the man attacked, his face contorted with rage. Emily started to cry. "Make it stop." James grabbed a bottle of water and tried to douse the flames, but the fire didn't waver. Instead, the vision shifted. Now the fire showed a ritual. Hooded figures stood in a circle, their hands raised toward the sky. In the center, a young woman knelt, her face streaked with tears. The hooded figures began chanting, their words incomprehensible but heavy with malice. The flames flared as the woman screamed, her body consumed by the fire within the fire. The Callahans backed away, but no matter how far they moved, the fire's light seemed to follow them, stretching impossibly long into the forest. "This isn't real," James muttered, his voice shaking. "It's just a trick of the mind. We're tired." But then the final vision began. This time, the fire reflected the Callahans themselves. The three of them sat around the campfire, just as they had moments ago. But in the vision, their faces were hollow and pale, their eyes wide with terror. In the flames, Shadows closed in around them, dragging them into the darkness. Emily screamed, and James pulled her into his arms. "We're leaving. Now." They scrambled to pack their gear, their movements frantic. The fire burned brighter, the blue flames casting grotesque shadows on the trees. As they fled the clearing, the forest seemed to shift around them. Paths that had been clear earlier now twisted in unfamiliar directions, and the trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. Sarah tripped, scraping her hands on the rough ground. James helped her up, but when they looked back, the clearing with the campfire was there again, as if they had never left. "We're trapped," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No, we'll find a way out," James insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. They tried again, running in a different direction, but the forest always led them back to the clearing. The fire was still burning, its flames now impossibly tall, licking at the night sky. When dawn finally broke, the Callahans were back where they started, their tent untouched, the fire still crackling. But something was different. Emily was gone. "Emily!" Sarah screamed, searching frantically around the clearing. James joined her, calling their daughter's name. Then they saw her. She was standing by the fire, her eyes blank, her face pale. She turned to them, her lips moving silently, as if she were speaking words they couldn't hear. "Emily!" James ran toward her, but as he reached out, she vanished into the flames. The fire roared, swallowing her whole, and the visions began again, this time showing James and Sarah as part of the horrors. They realized, too late, that they had become part of the cycle. The ghost campfire would burn forever, waiting for its next victims. Story 3. Echoes of Betrayal. Jack adjusted the straps of his hiking pack, the nylon digging into his shoulders. The late afternoon sun filtered through the towering pines, casting long, dappled shadows on the forest floor. Beside him, Olivia consulted her map again, her brow furrowed in frustration. "This doesn't make any sense," she muttered, tracing the paper with her finger. "We've been walking for hours, but we're right back where we started." Jack looked around, recognizing the same moss-covered boulder and crooked tree with the jagged scar on its trunk. His stomach churned. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," he offered, though doubt tinged his voice. "No," Olivia snapped. "I've been following this map perfectly." She paused, taking a deep breath to calm herself. "Let's just try one more time. The sun's still up, and we can always camp here if it gets late." Jack nodded, though unease prickled at the back of his neck. The forest was eerily quiet, too quiet. No bird song, no rustling of leaves in the breeze, just the muffled crunch of their boots on the soft earth. As they moved forward, the trail twisted and turned, narrowing in some places and widening in others. Yet every time they thought they were making progress, the same landmarks reappeared. The moss-covered boulder, the scarred tree. A sense of déjà vu settled over them like a heavy fog. "This isn't possible," Olivia said, her voice trembling. She dropped the map, letting it flutter to the ground. "We're going in circles, but I don't see how." Jack crouched to pick up the map, but something caught his eye, a faint movement in the corner of his vision. He whipped his head around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice low. "See what?" Olivia asked, clutching the straps of her pack tightly. "I don't know, movement. Something in the trees." They both stood still, their breath shallow. The air seemed thicker now, oppressive, as though the forest itself were leaning in to listen. And then they heard it, a faint crunch of leaves behind them. Jack turned, but again there was nothing there. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing unnaturally through the trees. The sound of footsteps stopped. "Let's keep moving," Olivia whispered, grabbing his arm. They hurried along the trail, their pace quickening with each step. The landmarks came and went again, mocking them, but something else was different now. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, and the footsteps had returned, this time matching their own. Jack stopped suddenly, causing Olivia to bump into him. "Look," he said, pointing ahead. At first, Olivia didn't see it, but as her eyes adjusted to the dimming light, she saw what Jack had noticed, a figure standing on the trail. It was distant, shrouded in the twilight gloom, but its outline was unmistakable. "Another hiker?" Olivia asked, though her voice betrayed her doubt. "Maybe," Jack said. "Hey, are you lost too?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned and walked off the trail, disappearing into the woods. "That's not right," Olivia said, her voice shaky. "Why wouldn't they say anything?" Jack swallowed hard. "Maybe they're scared like us. Let's keep going." But as they continued, more figures began to appear. Some stood motionless. Others moved jerkily, like puppets on tangled strings. Their faces were indistinct, smudged, as though someone had blurred them out. "They're not real," Olivia said, her voice rising. "They can't be real." One of the figures stepped closer, and Olivia let out a gasp. It was wearing a backpack identical to hers. The same color, the same patches stitched onto the fabric. Jack grabbed her arm. "Don't look at them. Just keep walking." But it was too late. The phantom hikers began to mimic their movements, turning their heads and stepping in sync. Their distorted features twisted into grotesque smiles, teeth too sharp, eyes too dark. "Run!" Jack shouted, pulling Olivia with him. They sprinted down the trail, their hearts pounding in their chests. The figures didn't follow at first, but the footsteps came again, louder, faster, closer. The trail seemed endless, a cruel loop designed to break them. Jack's legs burned, and Olivia's breathing came in ragged gasps, but they didn't stop. Finally, they burst into a small clearing. The open space should have brought relief, but instead, it felt like stepping into the center of a trap. The figures emerged from the trees, surrounding the clearing, their movements erratic and unnatural. Olivia clutched Jack's hand. "What do we do?" Before he could answer, the ground beneath them shifted. The dirt rippled like water, and roots snaked up, wrapping around their ankles. "The trail," Jack said, his voice barely audible. "It's alive." The figures closed in, their blurred faces tilting in unison. The forest itself seemed to hum, a low, malevolent sound that vibrated in their bones. As the roots pulled them down, the last thing Jack saw was his own distorted reflection in the empty eyes of the phantom campers. When the sun rose the next morning, the trail was empty, save for two new figures standing silently among the trees. Their features were smudged, incomplete, like echoes of what they had once been. The trail had claimed them, as it had so many others before, and it would wait patiently for the next travelers to wander into its endless loop. Story 4. The Lantern Man. The forest at Ravenswood wasn't marked on many maps. It sprawled over miles of untamed wilderness, its trees dense and ancient, their twisted roots gripping the earth like the fingers of something that refused to let go. There were stories about Ravenswood, of course. Every town had its ghost tales, but none more infamous than the legend of the Lantern Man. He was said to appear on foggy nights, a spectral figure clutching an old lantern. According to local lore, the light could guide you out of the forest if you were lost. But if you followed it, you risked never leaving the woods at all. Some swore he was the spirit of a lost woodsman, while others claimed he was something far older, a creature born of the forest itself. A group of campers, 4 friends from college, decided to test the legend. They were young, bold, and foolish, the kind who believed that danger only happened to other people. Jake, the self-proclaimed leader, carried their gear and a crooked grin. Laura, skeptical and sharp-tongued, had a headlamp strapped to her forehead, its beam cutting through the growing dusk. Danny, quieter than the rest, filmed everything on his GoPro, while Emily, whose nervous laughter betrayed her unease, trailed behind them. "Come on, Em," Jay called, pausing to let her catch up. "It's just a story. You believe in ghost lights now." Emily forced a laugh. "I don't believe in them, but I also don't want to be in one of those stories where everyone who doesn't believe ends up dead." Laura rolled her eyes. "Ghosts aren't real. The scariest thing in these woods is probably a raccoon." The trail they followed wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing closer together until the sky above was little more than slivers of fading light. By the time they reached their campsite, the shadows were long, and a faint mist had begun to creep between the trunks. They set up their tents quickly, joking about the legend while the campfire crackled. Danny insisted on filming their conversation, saying it would make great footage for his YouTube channel. "So," he began, pointing the camera at Jake, "what's your take on the Lantern Man?" Jake grinned and puffed out his chest. "I think it's a load of crap, but if he's real, I'd love to meet him. I'd ask for directions back to town." Laura snorted. "Maybe he'd lead you to a McDonald's. You'd follow any light if it promised fries." They laughed, but Emily's gaze kept drifting to the trees beyond the firelight. The mist had thickened, clinging to the ground like smoke, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. "Guys," she said, her voice low, "do you hear that?" The laughter died. Danny lowered his camera. They listened, the crackling fire suddenly too loud. "What are we listening for?" Jake asked. "Nothing," Emily whispered. "That's the problem. No crickets, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hoot of an owl. Just silence, heavy and oppressive." Then, faintly, they saw it, a flicker of light in the distance. "There," Laura said, pointing. "What is that?" Jake leaned forward, squinting. "Someone's out there. Maybe another camper." Danny adjusted his camera. "Or maybe it's the Lantern Man. he said, half joking. The light bobbed closer, weaving between the trees. It wasn't steady like a flashlight. It had a faint, wavering quality, as though it were alive. "Let's check it out," Jake said, standing. Emily grabbed his arm. "Are you insane? We don't know what that is." "Relax, Em. It's probably just some hiker." Reluctantly, the group followed the light. It moved slowly, always just out of reach, drawing them deeper into the woods. The mist grew thicker, swirling around their ankles, and the trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal arms. "Jake," Laura said after a while, her voice strained. "Maybe we should go back. This doesn't feel right." But Jake ignored her, his eyes fixed on the light. "We're close. Come on." Emily tugged on Danny's sleeve. "Turn back with me. Please." Danny hesitated, glancing at the camera in his hand. "Let's see where it leads," he said, though his voice wavered. They pressed on until the light stopped, hovering in a small clearing. It hung in the air, flickering gently, illuminating the fog like a pale sun. "That's it," Laura said. "A stupid floating light?" Then the light dimmed. A shadow began to take shape beneath it, tall and impossibly thin, its form barely human. Two hollow eyes stared out from the darkness, and a deep, guttural whisper echoed through the clearing. "You're lost." The voice wasn't loud, but it rattled their bones, sinking into their minds. The figure stepped forward, and the lantern swung at its side, casting flickering shadows that danced unnaturally. Emily screamed and turned to run, but the mist had thickened into a wall, blocking their escape. "Stay together," Jake shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. The figure moved closer, the lantern's light growing brighter and more blinding. The whisper became a roar, a deafening cacophony that drowned out their panicked cries. And then, one by one, they vanished. The next morning, the campsite was empty. Their tents stood untouched, the fire reduced to cold ash. Search parties found no trace of the group, only Danny's camera lying in the clearing. The last frame showed the lantern light flickering in the fog, growing impossibly bright before the screen went dark. To this day, hikers in Ravenswood swear they've seen the Lantern Man's light. Some say it's a warning to stay away, while others believe it's an invitation to join the lost. And those who follow it, they're never seen again. Story 5. The Red Tent. The lake stretched out like a mirror, undisturbed and calm, as Jack and Emma set up their campsite on its pebbled shore. They had driven hours to find this spot, a secluded haven far from the crowds and noise of the city. The early evening light shimmered across the surface, painting the water gold. Jack was busy with the tent poles while Emma arranged their supplies. "Look at that," she said, pointing across the lake. There, on the opposite shore, sat a weathered red tent. Its fabric was faded, almost pink in spots, as if it had endured years of sun and rain. "Someone beat us to it," Jack said with a shrug, returning to his work. Emma squinted. "But there's no car, no boat, nothing. Just the tent." Jack glanced up again, this time frowning. It did seem odd. He cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted, "Hello? Anybody there?" His voice echoed across the lake, but no response came. The red tent sat silent, unmoving. Maybe they're hiking, Jack offered, or fishing somewhere down the shore. Emma didn't reply. She kept her eyes on the tent, a chill creeping down her spine despite the warm evening air. As night fell, they built a fire and roasted marshmallows, the red tint slipping from their minds. The forest around them came alive with the soft hum of insects and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Around midnight, Emma stirred in her sleeping bag. A faint sound reached her ears, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. She nudged Jack awake. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Jack groaned but sat up listening. The noise came again, a soft rustling, circling their tent. "Probably a raccoon," he muttered, grabbing a flashlight. The beam of light swept across the campsite, illuminating the trees and the edge of the lake. Nothing moved. Satisfied, Jack crawled back into his sleeping bag. "See? Nothing. Go to sleep." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, the sun was bright, and the unease of the night felt like a distant memory. Over breakfast, Emma couldn't stop glancing across the lake at the red tent. "I want to check it out," she said. Jack hesitated. "Why?" "It's none of our business. Something about it feels wrong. I just want to see if anyone's there." After a brief argument, Jack relented, and they set off in their inflatable kayak. As they paddled closer, the red tint loomed larger, its tattered edges flapping slightly in the breeze. When they reached the shore, the silence was deafening. No birds, no insects, just the quiet lap of water against the rocks. Jack unzipped the tent. It was empty. Inside, the floor was covered in dirt and leaves. No sleeping bag, no gear, nothing to suggest anyone had been there recently. "See? Probably abandoned," Jack said, brushing his hands off. But Emma's eyes were fixed on something inside. A photograph lay in the center of the tent, its edges curled with age. She picked it up with trembling hands. It was a picture of her and Jack, taken from above. They were sleeping in their tent, the angle suggesting it was taken just last night. Emma's stomach turned. "This can't be real. Jack, who took this?" Jack stared at the photo, his face pale. "We need to leave. Now." Back at their campsite, they hurriedly packed their belongings. Jack kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting someone to emerge from the woods. As they zipped up their gear, they noticed the ground around their tent. Strange symbols had been carved into the dirt, circles, lines, and jagged shapes that seemed to form a pattern. "Were these here before?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. Jack shook his head, sweat beading on his brow. "No, I would have noticed." The symbols seemed to pulse in the daylight, as though they were alive. A low, guttural noise rumbled from the forest, freezing them in place. It wasn't an animal, nor the wind. It was something else, something they couldn't name. "Get in the car," Jack hissed, grabbing Emma's hand. As they drove away, the lake disappeared behind them, but the feeling of being watched didn't. Emma clutched the photograph in her lap, unable to let it go. "We'll report this," Jack said, though his voice lacked conviction. Emma nodded, but deep down, she knew they wouldn't. Who would believe them? A red tent, strange symbols, a photograph of them sleeping. It sounded insane. But as they pulled into their driveway hours later, Emma froze. Sitting on their front porch was the red tent, its fabric fluttering in the breeze. And inside, another photograph awaited them. This time, it showed them pulling into the driveway, taken from somewhere impossibly high, as if the watcher was already waiting for them. Story 6. The Bone Collector's Clearing. The forest felt different as soon as they crossed the rusted sign that read, "No trespassing. Danger." It wasn't just the way the sunlight seemed to vanish behind the towering pines, or how the bird song faded into silence. It was the air, thick, heavy, almost suffocating. It clung to their skin like a warning, but teenagers don't heed warnings. Not when there's a chance to explore the forbidden. "Are you sure this is the place?" Danny asked, glancing back at Claire, who was fumbling with the map. "Positive," she replied, her voice clipped. She hated being second-guessed, especially by her brother. "It's just a little farther. The clearing should be up ahead." Claire had heard the stories. The kind kids whispered around campfires to scare each other. A haunted clearing deep in the woods, littered with bones and cursed by something ancient. It was said that those who ventured there never returned. But Claire wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. She was here to prove the legend was just that, a story. Danny wasn't so sure. Neither was Sarah, who clung to his arm like a lifeline, or Chris, who kept looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone, or something, to jump out from the shadows. "Man, this place is creepy," Chris muttered, his usual bravado muted. "Maybe we should head back." "Don't be such a wimp," Claire snapped. "We didn't come all this way to chicken out now." The group pressed on, the forest growing denser with each step. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches intertwining to block out the sky. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath their boots and the occasional snap of a twig. Then they saw it, the clearing. It was as if the forest had been abruptly carved open. The trees stopped in a perfect circle, their roots clawing at the edges of the bare earth like they were trying to hold it back. In the center lay a bizarre arrangement of bones. Animal bones, mostly. Skulls, rib cages, femurs, all meticulously placed in spirals and concentric circles. The patterns were too deliberate, too precise, to be the work of scavengers. "This is insane," Danny whispered, his voice barely audible. He stepped closer, kneeling to examine a skull. "Looks like a deer. Who would do this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Some kind of ritual, maybe," Claire suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. She pulled out her phone to take a picture, but the screen stayed black. "Dead battery. Great," she muttered, shoving it back in her pocket. Chris walked the perimeter, kicking at the ground to unearth anything hidden. "It's probably just some freak trying to scare people, like one of those art installations or something." An art installation in the middle of nowhere. Danny shot back. "Who cares?" Claire said. "We found it, didn't we? That's all that matters." But as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the clearing, an uneasy feeling settled over the group. The pattern seemed to shift when they weren't looking, the spirals tightening, the circles overlapping. And then there was a sound, a faint clicking like bones tapping against each other. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, clutching Danny's arm. "It's just the wind," Claire said, though her voice wavered. She glanced around, her confidence faltering. The forest seemed darker now, the trees pressing in like a crowd. Then they saw it. A new set of bones had appeared near the edge of the clearing. They were smaller, human-like. A hand, perfectly intact, its fingers curled as if reaching for something. "Okay, that's enough," Chris said, backing away. "This isn't funny anymore." "No one's laughing," Danny muttered, his eyes fixed on the hand. "We need to leave." But the forest didn't want them to leave. As they turned to go, the ground beneath their feet shifted. Roots coiled and twisted, snaking toward the clearing. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, as if urging them to stay. Claire tripped, falling hard against the dirt. She looked up, and her scream tore through the air. The bones were moving. They slid and scraped across the clearing, assembling themselves into grotesque shapes. Rib cages rose on spindly legs, skulls perched atop makeshift spines. The constructs twitched and jerked like marionettes, their hollow eye sockets fixed on the group. "Run!" Danny shouted, yanking Claire to her feet. They bolted, tearing through the forest in blind panic. The clicking followed, echoing through the trees. Chris stumbled, a root catching his ankle. He hit the ground hard, and before anyone could help him, the roots dragged him back toward the clearing. His screams faded as the forest swallowed him whole. "Don't stop," Danny yelled, pulling Sarah along. Claire was ahead of them, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But the forest seemed endless, the trees closing in no matter how far they ran. Finally, they burst into a small meadow, gasping for air. The clicking had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. "Where's Chris?" Sarah sobbed, clutching her knees. "We have to go back for him." "He's gone," Danny said, his voice hollow. "Did you see what that place was?" He's gone." Claire stared at the edge of the meadow, her face pale. "It's not over." Before Danny could ask what she meant, the bones appeared again, crawling out of the shadows. They moved faster now, assembling into a towering figure, a grotesque skeleton with too many limbs and a gaping maw. The bone collector. It reached for them, its skeletal fingers stretching impossibly long. The friends screamed, scattering in different directions. Claire ran blindly, the bone collector's clicking growing louder behind her. She tripped again, her hands scraping against the dirt. When she looked up, she was back in the clearing. The spirals of bones were complete now, and at the center lay Chris's lifeless body, his face frozen in terror. The ground beneath her shifted, the roots wrapping around her legs. She clawed at the dirt, screaming, as the bone collector loomed over her. The forest would feed again, and no one would ever find her. Story 7. The Forgotten Scouts. The four of them had planned this trip for months. Mark, Jenna, Ben, and Olivia, lifelong friends since high school, were now scattered across different cities and desperate for a reunion. When Jenna suggested camping in the Pinewood National Forest, none of them could have guessed the horrors that awaited them. By the time they reached the secluded campsite, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The towering pines cast long, jagged shadows across the clearing. "This is perfect," Mark declared, tossing his pack onto the ground. Ben started gathering firewood while Olivia and Jenna pitched the tent. As Mark wandered the perimeter, kicking at rocks and snapping photos of the scenery, his boot struck something half buried in the dirt. Curious, he knelt and began brushing away the earth. "What did you find?" Jenna asked, stepping over. Mark pulled out a leather-bound book, its cover cracked and brittle with age. The edges were frayed, and the faded words "Scout's Guide to the Wild" were etched across the front. "A scout handbook." Olivia scoffed, joining them. "Well, like Boy Scouts." "Looks ancient," Mark said, flipping it open. The pages were yellowed and smelled of mildew. At first glance, it seemed like a standard guide. Knots, first aid, how to identify poisonous plants. But as Mark turned deeper into the book, the sketches became unsettling. One page depicted a circle of people holding hands around a massive tree, their faces eerily blank. Another showed strange symbols carved into a tree trunk, with what looked like blood dripping from the markings. The instructions grew stranger too. "Offer your fear to the forest," one line read. "The watchers are always near," said another. "Creepy," Ben muttered, peering over Mark's shoulder. "Just someone's idea of a joke," Jenna said, though her voice wavered. They laughed it off, tossing the book onto the pile of gear near the fire pit. But as the evening wore on, their laughter grew more forced. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hoot of an owl. By the time darkness swallowed the campsite, the silence was suffocating. That night, as they sat around the crackling fire, Mark swore he saw something move at the edge of the light. "Did you see that?" he asked, pointing into the trees. "See what?" Jenna said, her voice sharp. "There was someone, I swear, someone was standing right there." Olivia and Ben exchanged uneasy glances. "You're probably just spooking yourself," Olivia said. "This forest is ancient. Your eyes are playing tricks." But Mark wasn't convinced. The image of a shadowy figure standing between the trees gnawed at him. An hour later, the fire was reduced to embers, and the group retreated to the tent. They zipped themselves in, but the strange feeling of being watched lingered. In the dead of night, Jenna woke to a faint rustling sound outside the tent. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't wind, it was footsteps. "Guys," she whispered, shaking Olivia awake. "Do you hear that?" The others stirred, groggy and irritable. "What is it now?" Mark grumbled. "Listen," Jenna hissed. The footsteps stopped. They held their breath, ears straining against the oppressive silence. Then came another sound, a soft, scraping noise, like fabric dragging against bark. "What the hell is that?" Ben whispered. Mark unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had long since gone out, and the clearing was bathed in faint moonlight. His breath caught in his throat. Standing just beyond the edge of the clearing were three figures. Their silhouettes were dark, unmoving. They were wearing uniforms, faded, tattered scout uniforms. "Guys," Mark choked out, "we're not alone." The four of them scrambled out of the tent, panic surging through their veins. The figures didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. "What do we do?" Olivia whispered. "We leave," Ben said, grabbing his flashlight. As they gathered their things, the figures began to move, not toward them, but around them, circling the clearing with an eerie, deliberate rhythm. The beams of their flashlights flickered, as if the air itself was rejecting the light. Mark grabbed the Scout handbook, the unease it gave him now feeling like a tether to reality. As he flipped through the pages again, a new page seemed to appear, one that none of them had seen earlier. The ink was fresh, the words stark against the paper. Run, but you can't escape the forest. The figures stepped closer. Their faces came into view, or rather, the absence of faces. Their heads were smooth and featureless, the faint outlines of where eyes and mouths should have been nothing more than hollows. Mark screamed, dropping the book. The group bolted into the woods, their breaths ragged, their hearts pounding like war drums. The trees seemed alive, the roots shifting beneath their feet, trying to trip them. "Don't stop," Jenna shouted, but Olivia stumbled, her scream cutting through the night as something pulled her back into the darkness. "Olivia!" Ben yelled, but Mark grabbed his arm. "We can't go back." Mark shouted, "We have to keep moving." The figures followed, their movements unnaturally smooth, almost gliding through the trees. Every time they glanced back, more figures appeared, dozens of them, all wearing the same decayed uniforms, their hollow faces locked onto the fleeing campers. When they finally stumbled into a small clearing, the moonlight revealed a massive tree at its center. Its trunk was wide enough to hold a room, and its bark was covered in strange symbols, the same ones from the handbook. "We're trapped," Ben cried. The figures closed in, forming a silent circle around the clearing. One by one, they raised their arms, pointing at the campers. Mark fell to his knees, clutching the handbook. The final page had changed again, the words now bleeding off the paper. "The forest must feed." Before he could react, the roots of the massive tree burst from the ground, snaking toward them like living things. Ben was the first to be taken, the roots wrapping around his legs and pulling him screaming into the earth. Jenna followed, her terrified cries echoing into the night. Mark and Olivia clung to each other, but the roots were relentless. As Mark was dragged backward, he caught one last glimpse of the tree. Its bark shifted, revealing dozens of faces. Faces of those who had been taken, their features frozen in eternal terror. The last thing Mark saw before the darkness claimed him was his own reflection forming in the bark. The forest was silent again. The next morning, the clearing was empty, save for a tattered Scout handbook lying in the dirt. It waited patiently for the next visitors. Story 8. The Screaming Stones. The hike up the ridge had been grueling, but the view was worth it. For friends, Nate, Alyssa, Caleb, and Jenna stood at the crest of a remote trail in northern Montana, staring down at the vast forest stretching below them. At its center, an ancient rock formation jutted out like broken teeth. The locals called it the Screaming Stones, though no one could say why. Nate had read about it online, and as the self-proclaimed leader of their group, he had insisted on seeing it firsthand. "Looks spooky," Jenna muttered, her auburn hair tangled from the wind. "Spooky is the point," Nate replied with a grin. "It's just rocks." You all scared of rocks? Alyssa rolled her eyes. It's not the rocks. It's the isolation. If we break a leg out here, no one's coming to save us. Relax, Caleb said, adjusting his backpack. We got plenty of gear. Let's camp near the stones. I bet they look even cooler up close. The group descended the trail, reaching the clearing just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The stones were massive, each as tall as a man, arranged in a loose semicircle. Time and weather had worn them smooth, except for the carvings. Faces. Each stone bore a face etched into its surface. They weren't like the serene, ancient carvings of Easter Island. These faces were twisted with expressions of agony. Mouths wide open in silent screams, eyes hollow and sunken. Jesus, Alyssa whispered, running her fingers over one. Who would carve something like this? They don't look carved, Caleb said, his voice uneasy. It's like the stone formed this way. Nate brushed it off with a laugh. Nature's creepy. That's all. Let's get the fire going. They set up camp a few yards from the stones, their tents forming a rough circle. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, an unsettling quiet fell over the forest. There were no chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, unnatural silence. It was Jenna who first heard it. A faint, guttural sound drifted through the air, almost too low to catch. She froze, her marshmallow stick hovering over the flames. Did you hear that? She whispered. What? Nate asked, but then he stopped, his smile fading. The sound grew louder. A long, low scream, like something being tortured. It's the wind, Nate said quickly, though his voice lacked confidence. There's no wind, Caleb said, his eyes darting to the stones. The screaming intensified, rising and falling in waves. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. It had a strange, guttural quality, like the cries of an animal mixed with something far more sinister. Okay, this is not normal, Alyssa said, standing up. We need to leave. Calm down, Nate said, though he too was standing now. It's probably just some kind of wildlife, but the screams weren't coming from the forest. They were coming from the stones. The friends turned as one, staring at the ancient monoliths. The faces etched into the rocks seemed to shift in the flickering firelight. Their mouths opened wider, their eyes hollow pits of darkness. Pack up, Jenna said, her voice trembling. We're leaving now. Nate nodded, finally shaken. They scrambled to gather their belongings, but the screams grew louder, almost deafening. As Jenna reached for her backpack, she noticed something odd. Her shadow, cast by the fire, didn't match her movements. It stretched unnaturally toward the stones. Guys, she whispered, but before she could say more, she was yanked backward. The others spun around, their flashlights catching the briefest glimpse of Jenna's terrified face before she was dragged into the nearest stone. The surface rippled like water, and she was gone. Jenna! Alyssa screamed, rushing toward the stone, but Caleb grabbed her arm. Don't! Look! The face on the stone had changed. It was Jenna's face now, frozen in a silent scream. The remaining three stumbled back, panic setting in. We have to get out of here, Alyssa cried. They ran, abandoning their tents and supplies, but the forest seemed to close in around them. No matter which direction they turned, the stones loomed ahead, their screaming faces multiplying. Caleb was the next to go. A root snaked out from the ground, tripping him. He fell hard, and before Nate or Alyssa could react, the earth beneath him opened like a maw. He was swallowed whole, his screams joining the cacophony. Nate and Alyssa sprinted blindly, tears streaming down their faces. "We have to keep going," Nate shouted, but Alyssa stopped abruptly. She was staring at a tree, her flashlight shaking in her hand. Carved into the bark was Caleb's face, his expression one of utter terror. "They're everywhere," she whispered. The screams grew louder, the faces appearing on trees, rocks, even the ground itself. Nate grabbed Alyssa's hand and pulled her forward. "We can't stop," he yelled, but he didn't see the root until it was too late. It wrapped around his ankle, dragging him down. "Nate!" Alyssa screamed, trying to pull him free, but the root was too strong. His fingers clawed at the dirt as he was dragged toward a stone. "Run!" he shouted, just before the stone claimed him. His face appeared moments later, twisted in agony. Alyssa stumbled forward, her breath ragged, her mind a whirlwind of terror. She didn't know how far she ran, but eventually the screaming faded. The forest fell silent again. When she finally stopped, she was alone in a new clearing. A single stone stood in the center, blank and smooth. As she collapsed to her knees, sobbing, the stone began to change. Slowly, her own face emerged, mouth open in a scream she couldn't hear. The forest had claimed her too. The next group of hikers would find the abandoned campsite weeks later, the fire long extinguished. They would marvel at the stones and the faces carved into them, never realizing that the forest was watching and waiting for its next meal. Story 9. The Lake's Promise. The lake was beautiful, the kind of beauty that felt otherworldly. Nestled deep within the forest, miles away from cell service or civilization, it shimmered under the pale glow of the late afternoon sun. The water was unnaturally still, not a ripple disturbing its mirror-like surface. It reflected the dense pines and the gray sky so perfectly that it seemed like you could fall into another world just by touching it. "Pretty amazing, huh, buddy?" Tim said, setting down the heavy pack he'd been lugging for miles. He stretched his back, which popped audibly, and looked down at his son, Jonah. Jonah, 11 years old and small for his age, nodded silently. His wide brown eyes were fixed on the lake, unblinking. Tim chalked it up to awe. After all, it wasn't every day they got to experience a view like this. He ruffled Jonah's hair. "You don't see this back in the suburbs, huh?" Jonah didn't respond. Tim didn't notice the silence right away. He was busy unpacking their tent and laying out the supplies. They'd been planning this trip for months, a father-son getaway after the divorce. He'd needed this time with Jonah, needed to prove he could be a good dad despite the fractured family. "Jonah, come help me with this tent," Tim called, but Jonah didn't move. The boy's eyes stayed locked on the water, his thin frame standing perfectly still like a statue. A soft breeze rustled the leaves around them, but Jonah didn't react to that either. Tim frowned and walked over. "You okay, bud?" he asked, crouching down. Finally, Jonah turned to look at him. Do you hear that? Hear what? The voices. Tim froze, his stomach twisting. What voices? Jonah tilted his head toward the lake. They're calling to me. They said they can give me what I want. All I have to do is go in the water. Tim forced a laugh, though his voice came out strained. Well, that's creepy. Must be the wind playing tricks on you. Jonah didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just turned his head back to the lake. They said you can come too if you want. Tim stared at his son, his skin prickling with unease. Jonah's voice sounded strange, too flat, too certain for a kid his age. He shook off the feeling and stood. Let's focus on setting up camp. Okay, I'm starving, and we've got us mores to make later. Jonah didn't argue, but he kept glancing at the lake as they pitched the tent and built a small fire pit. The boy barely touched his dinner, which wasn't like him. Tim kept the conversation light, talking about their plans for the next day, but Jonah was distracted, answering in monosyllables. When darkness fell, the lake transformed. The stillness was eerie, the black water swallowing the faint moonlight. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. No sounds of insects or distant animals to break the silence. Dad, Jonah said quietly, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. Tim looked over from where he was stoking the fire. They're louder now, Jonah whispered. They're telling me I can be happy again. They know what I want. Tim's heart thudded in his chest. Jonah, it's just your imagination. Let's get some sleep? Okay. Jonah didn't reply. Instead, he crawled into the tent and zipped it shut. Tim sat by the fire a little longer, his unease growing with each passing minute. That night, Tim woke to the sound of splashing. At first, he thought he was dreaming, but when he turned and saw that Jonah's sleeping bag was empty, panic jolted him awake. Jonah, he called, unzipping the tent and stumbling outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the campsite. He spotted his son standing at the edge of the lake, the water lapping at his bare feet. Jonah, Tim yelled, running toward him. Jonah turned his head slowly, his face expressionless. They said I can see Mom again. Tim's blood ran cold. Jonah, come back here. Now. They said they can fix everything. Before Tim could reach him, Jonah stepped into the water. No. Tim screamed, his voice echoing across the silent forest. He lunged, grabbing for his son, but the boy was already waist deep. The water rippled unnaturally, pulling Jonah farther in with every step. Tim didn't hesitate. He dove into the lake, the icy water shocking his system. He swam toward Jonah, but the boy seemed impossibly far away, as if the lake was stretching the distance between them. Jonah, he cried, but his voice was swallowed by the water. As he swam deeper, the world around him grew darker. The surface above disappeared, and the water turned thick like syrup. He felt something brush against his leg, something cold and slimy. Then he saw them, faces, pale, distorted faces floating in the murky depths. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths frozen in silent screams. They surrounded him, watching, waiting. One of the faces drifted closer, and Tim recognized it with a jolt of terror. It was Jonah's mother. The faces began to whisper, their voices overlapping in a haunting chorus. They promised peace, happiness, everything he'd ever wanted. All he had to do was let go. Tim felt himself sinking, the lake pulling him down, the faces growing closer. But then he saw Jonah, just a few feet away, his small hand reaching out. Summoning every ounce of strength, Tim kicked against the pull of the lake and grabbed his son. He clung to Jonah, kicking upward, fighting the invisible force that tried to drag them both down. The surface seemed impossibly far, but finally they broke through, gasping for air. Tim hauled Jonah onto the shore and collapsed beside him, trembling. The lake was calm again, its surface smooth and unbroken. Jonah coughed and looked at his father with wide, frightened eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't know." Tim pulled him into a tight embrace, his heart pounding. "It's not your fault, buddy. We're leaving. Right now." They packed in silence, neither of them daring to look back at the lake. As they hiked away, Tim felt the weight of unseen eyes on his back, watching, waiting. He knew they'd been lucky to escape, but the lake wasn't done. It never was. Story 10. The Shadow Camp. It started with a laugh. That nervous, high-pitched laugh that seems to escape when you're alone in the wilderness, away from civilization, and your mind starts playing tricks on you. A group of 5 college friends, Jack, Lucy, Ben, Sarah, and Evan, had made their way into the woods, a weekend camping trip meant to get away from their busy lives. The kind of trip where the only distractions were the sounds of the forest and the flickering glow of a campfire. The campsite was far from any road, nestled deep in the trees where they could hear nothing but the whisper of the wind through the leaves and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. They'd set up their tents, gathered firewood, and were now relaxing around the fire, toasting marshmallows and swapping stories. By the time the fire had burned down to just a low flicker, the air had turned cool, and the shadows had deepened around them. The moon hung high in the sky, but the forest canopy above blocked much of its light, leaving everything in shadow except for the glowing embers. "Do you guys feel like we're being watched?" Lucy asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Ben, who had been staring off into the trees, shrugged. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she said, shivering despite the warmth of the fire. "It just feels like something's out there, like eyes on the back of my neck." Evan laughed. "Come on, Lucy. We're just in the woods. Nothing's out there. Just let the night be." But even as he said it, the others could feel it too. There was something about the night that felt off. It wasn't just the shadows, which were longer and darker than they should have been. It was as though the shadows themselves were watching them, shifting, changing with every flicker of the firelight. And then it happened. Ben was the first to notice it. He looked down at his feet, his shadow stretching out in front of him. But something wasn't right. The shadow wasn't mimicking his movements as it should. It was moving on its own, twisting and distorting in unnatural ways. Guys," he called out, his voice rising with confusion. "You might want to see this." The others turned to him, and all their eyes widened in disbelief. Ben's shadow wasn't just shifting. It was stretching out from his body, growing larger, longer, as though it had a life of its own. It curled around his legs like a serpent, its edges rippling like a breeze had caught it. It was moving faster than Ben was, slithering toward the fire as if it wanted to consume it. "Ben!" Sarah shouted, her voice tight with fear. "Move!" Ben tried to step back, but his shadow followed him, reaching out in sharp, jerky movements. He stumbled backward, away from the fire, but the shadow didn't stop. It stretched, creeping across the ground in a rush, until it split into two distinct shapes. One slithered up his arm, gripping it tightly, pulling him in the direction of the forest. "I can't," Ben gasped, struggling against the grip of his own shadow. The rest of the group was frozen in place, unable to move, their own shadows starting to react in similar ways. Lucy's shadow grew longer, curving toward the trees, while Sarah's shadow clung to her legs like a heavy weight. Jack and Evan were the only ones who hadn't moved, rooted to the ground in terror. "It's the shadows," Jack whispered. "They're not." But before he could finish his thought, his own shadow lurched forward and gripped him by the ankles. The shadows were alive. They pulled at their owners, pulling them toward the forest's edge. The trees loomed darker than ever before, their branches seeming to stretch higher into the sky. The night air grew colder, and the shadows, now thick and menacing, began to transform. Sarah screamed as her shadow turned into a figure, tall enough to stand above her, with limbs twisting and distorting unnaturally. The figure was no longer just a shadow. It was a silhouette of something darker, more sinister, with glowing eyes that seemed to burn into her very soul. The shadows were hunting them. Jack yanked free from the grip of his own shadow, pulling Lucy with him as they ran toward the only direction that seemed safe, the lake. But the shadows weren't letting them go. The longer they ran, the more the shadows stretched out before them, growing into towering shapes, as though the entire forest was alive with eyes that wanted them to stay. They reached the water, panting and out of breath, but the shadows followed them there, curling around the rocks and trees, pushing closer and closer. "What do we do?" Evan gasped. "How do we?" "Don't fight them," Jack shouted, grabbing Lucy by the wrist. "They're not going to stop unless we figure this out." He glanced around, his eyes darting from one shadow to the next. Each one was watching them now, its form more solid than before, like a predator closing in on its prey. Then Lucy froze, her eyes fixed on something in the water, and she pointed with a trembling finger. "Look, the water." The surface of the lake was dark, as if reflecting the night sky. But there, just beneath the surface, were more shadows. Hundreds of them, swirling and moving in the water, rising from the depths like creatures long forgotten. They were reaching, stretching, pulling themselves free from the water. It wasn't just the forest. It was the entire earth. The shadows were everywhere. The group huddled together as the shadows closed in around them, their shapes now larger than life, twisting and elongating. A low growl vibrated from within the forest, something deep, primal. The shadows had taken on their own consciousness, and they were feeding on the fear that had settled over the group. They were no longer just reflections. They were predators, and the campers were their prey. The last thing Lucy saw was her shadow, the one that had once been her friend, crawling up behind her, stretching toward her face, a mouth opening wide to consume her. And then everything went dark. The next morning, the forest was silent again. The campers' tents were left untouched, but there was no sign of the group. Their campsite remained undisturbed, except for the strange marks left in the ground where they had tried to flee. But their shadows, they were gone. No one ever spoke of them again, and the forest remained as it had always been, quiet, uninviting, and full of secrets. But if you go out there at night and stare into the trees, you might just see a glimpse of something moving, something dark, something hungry, and you'll know it's the shadows, always watching, always waiting.